I never imagined I would set foot in Austin again, not after the way my family buried my name, like it was something shameful. But there I was, standing in the thick Texas heat with a paper plate balanced in my hands, the smell of grilled meat everywhere, surrounded by people who smiled at each other and acted like I didn't exist. Every laugh, every sideways look reminded me that I had become their family cautionary tale. The one who reached too high and fell hard. They didn't invite me because they missed me. They invited me because ignoring me at a public event might make them look bad. The folding tables were crowded with ribs and brisket and coleslaw, and there was a chair for everyone, except for me. Claire, my perfect younger sister, moved through the crowd like she was floating, a soft summer dress swaying around her as friends and colleagues circled her like bees. They talked, they praised, and when their eyes brushed over me, it was like I wasn't even there. I stood near the grill, taking a pair of tongs just to keep my hands busy, when a man's voice cut through the noise. He was tall, with a square jaw, and that unmistakable posture that comes from years of training, wearing a polo with a federal agency emblem on it, Claire's new boyfriend. At first, he glanced at me, the way you glance at someone who doesn't matter. Then his head tilted, his eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, really looking this time like he had to be sure. "Wait," he said, loud enough for the yard to hear. "Director Lane?" The tongs nearly slipped from my hand. The word hung heavy in the air. My mother's face drained of color. My father froze mid-drink, and for a long moment there was nothing but silence. My name is Harper Lane. Though most people here pretend they have forgotten it, for years that name was spoken only in secure rooms, in briefing halls without windows, whispered in conversations that never made it onto paper. Before that night in Austin, nobody at this barbecue had any idea who I had been or what I had done, and I had learned to live with that. They think I disappeared because I was weak, because I gave up. But the truth is, I walked away from them long before they had a chance to push me out. My life was built on silence, and I wore it like armor. I was an analyst first, buried in data no one else knew how to read, and then I became something else, a strategist who could see patterns where others saw chaos. They pulled me from the noise and placed me in rooms where the stakes were lives, not pride. Every step I took carried me further from the girl they used to know and closer to a world they will never see. I worked for the Department of Justice, then in units so classified they don't officially exist. For a time, I led one of those divisions, a team that moved unseen, building cases and preventing disasters before the headlines could even be written. I held secrets that could change careers, topple people, and save others. And yet none of that ever made it home. Not to these people who once called me daughter and sister. To them, I was the mistake. The one who vanished after a single story in the news made me look like a failure. They never knew that I never stopped fighting. They never asked, and I never told them, until that single word, director, escaped someone else's mouth and brought the truth back into the light. That night in Richmond was like every other for the past few years, quiet enough that I could hear the hum of traffic through double-paned glass and the tick of the old clock on the mantel. My house is small, more of a refuge than a home, a place where I can disappear when the weight of the world feels too heavy. I sat at my desk, surrounded by stacks of unopened mail, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the floor. My phone buzzed once, just one small vibration that shattered the calm. I looked down and saw the message. Family dinner and Claire's recognition ceremony in Houston. Mom wants you there. No hello, no how are you, not even my name. It felt more like a summons than an invitation, a reminder that even when they want me, it's only on their terms. I stared at those words for a long time, the screen dimming in my hand, before I set the phone face down like it might burn me if I held it any longer. It took me back to the day everything changed, Seattle. The incident they never stopped whispering about, the one that turned me into a headline and then a ghost. That day, I made a call that cost someone their life. and the press built a story around it that my family never bothered to question. They didn't ask for details. They didn't wait for the truth. They just erased me as neatly as if I'd never existed. My stocking disappeared from the mantle at Christmas. My name was left off invitations. I stopped getting calls. From that moment, there were two lanes: the family they held onto and me. The failure they pretended had never been part of them. Driving back into Houston felt like driving into a version of the past that refused to change. The skyline rose sharp against the flat horizon, the same streets I'd once memorized, now blurred by years of distance. I parked the rental car in front of the Federal Civic Hall, a building all glass and polished steel, a place built for ceremonies and for people who want to be seen. Inside, the air smelled of flowers and new carpet, a place where everything had been carefully arranged to look perfect. Faces turned as I walked in, not with warmth, but with that quiet curiosity people have when they're deciding whether you belong. I handed my coat to a young attendant who scanned a list, found nothing, and said in a careful tone, "Overflow table in the back." There was no hesitation in his voice, just that polite distance of someone who has been told where people like me belong. The hall itself was full of long, round tables covered in white linen, centerpieces of roses, and place cards with names printed in elegant script. None of those cards had mine. I followed him past the front rows, past the people in evening gowns and suits, past the tables where my parents sat surrounded by friends. My table was tucked into a corner near the coffee station, behind a line of people waiting for espresso and pastries. The chair creaked when I pulled it out, and from there, I could see everything without being seen. Conversations flowed around me, but nobody sat beside me, not at first. To them, I was a stranger, a shadow that had wandered in where she wasn't supposed to be. I didn't argue. I just sat down quietly, because I hadn't come back to be welcomed. The lights dimmed and the conversation softened as Claire walked to the podium. She looked exactly as I remembered she would. Polished, deliberate, every step measured as if the whole room had been rehearsed just for her. The navy dress she wore fit like it had been chosen for this single moment. Diamond studs catching the light as she smiled to the crowd. She thanked the committee, her mentors, the people who believed in her, and then she began talking about family. Her words were smooth, almost tender, but every sentence felt sharpened. She said she had learned that true strength comes from surrounding yourself with those who stay steady, those who never let mistakes define them. She talked about integrity, about judgment, about how some people crumble under pressure while others rise above it. She never looked at me, not once. But she didn't have to. Every word was a mirror turned in my direction, and everyone in the hall could hear the blade behind her praise. I sat at the far table with my hands folded on my lap, watching the way my parents leaned toward her with pride shining in their faces. I felt the eyes of people at the nearby tables flicker toward me every few sentences, curious but pretending they weren't. My glass of water was warm by the time she finished, my soda flat, and I held it just to have something to do with my hands. The applause that followed her closing line was immediate and loud, like they were clapping for themselves as much as for her. My father clapped a little longer than the others. My mother dabbed at her eyes, and in that moment Claire smiled like a queen standing over conquered ground, sure the person she had left behind would never rise again. The applause was still fading when I noticed movement at the far end of the hall. A man in a sharply pressed federal uniform was making his way through the tables with a kind of focus you don't fake. His shoulders were squared, his eyes scanning the room like he was on an assignment, not a celebration. Even before he reached me, I recognized him. Years ago, he was one of mine, a young field agent who learned fast and never forgot orders, Jordan Cole. He stopped 2 steps away from my table, the kind of stillness that made everyone nearby look up. For a moment, his gaze held mine, weighing the years between us, and then his voice carried across the hall with perfect clarity. "Director Lane?" he said. No hesitation, No doubt. The room froze around us as if someone had pressed pause. The woman beside me stopped mid-sip. A fork clattered somewhere behind me, and the hum of quiet conversation collapsed into silence. My father's hand stalled mid-clap, my mother's smile faltered, and Claire's head turned sharply in our direction, confusion flashing across her face. I didn't stand up, I didn't return the greeting with anything grand. I simply looked at him, held his eyes, and gave a single small nod. "Thank you, Agent Cole," I said, my voice steady enough to cut through the air. He saluted then, crisp and professional, nothing exaggerated, but in that setting the gesture was louder than any speech. For one suspended moment, I wasn't the outcast or the failure. I was who I had always been, and everyone in that room had to watch and recognize that truth, whether they wanted to or not. The moment the crowd began to move again, Cole gestured subtly toward the side exit, and I followed him out of the hall into a narrow service corridor that smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. Away from the noise, his face changed, the polite formality replaced by something far sharper. "We've got a problem," he said in a low voice, his tone all business. 3 days ago, there was an unauthorized access into WitnessNet. That name hit like ice. WitnessNet was the backbone of federal witness protection, a system where a single breach could destroy lives. He handed me a tablet, the screen already open to a set of access logs. "The breach originated here, from Houston," he continued. "We traced it to a device registered to Claire Lane." For a long moment, I just stared at the screen, at the string of numbers and codes that spelled out disaster. "Are you certain?" I asked, my voice quiet but hard. He nodded once. "I double-checked before coming here. It's her login, but the token used came from someone else entirely, someone high up." The name on the log burned into my mind, but what unsettled me more was the implication. Either Claire was being used as a shield, or she was in much deeper than she realized. Cole's eyes stayed on mine. "If they have her credentials, it won't stay hidden for long. You know what happens if this leaks." I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of something bigger than family hanging over me. "I'm staying," I told him, sliding the tablet back. "Let them think I'm here for dinner and forgiveness. Meanwhile, you dig deeper. I need to know exactly what she's walked into." He gave a grim nod, and together we stepped back into the noise as if nothing had changed. I stayed in Houston the next day, booking a room at a nondescript business hotel where the air smelled of stale coffee and the carpets muffled every step. Cole and I divided the work. He would track the digital trail, and I would follow the human one. My first stop was the federal building downtown, a fortress of glass and concrete that never lets you forget you are being watched the moment you walk in. I signed in with an old Department of Justice credential that still opened a few doors, enough to earn me polite smiles and cautious stares. Inside the cafe on the first floor, he was already waiting. Samuel Rhodes, Claire's mentor and the man who had built her career. His handshake was firm, the kind of grip that means to establish control, and his smile was the polished kind that hides as much as it reveals. We sat at a table in the corner, surrounded by agents pretending not to listen. "I've heard so much about you," he said as he stirred his coffee, voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "Claire talks about you all the time. You know she sees you as a legend, even if she'd never say it aloud." His words were light, but his eyes didn't blink, and the way he spoke about her, like she was bright but naive, made my skin tighten. I asked him about her work, and he gave me nothing but vague compliments wrapped in warnings, the kind of language a man uses when he wants to keep someone close without ever letting them see the whole picture. There was something too careful about him, something that rang false. When I left that building and stepped into the damp Texas heat, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. If Claire had been pulled into something dangerous, Rhodes was standing at the center of it. Late that evening, as the Houston sky turned the color of tarnished copper, my phone buzzed with a secure message from Cole. I opened it to find a video file attached. Grainy footage pulled from a parking garage camera, 3 weeks old. At first, it showed nothing more than Samuel Rhodes walking quickly across a dimly lit concrete floor, looking over his shoulder like a man who knows he has no business being there. Then another figure emerged from the shadows. Taller, older, hair gone gray, and a tan trench coat that moved with him like a second skin. Even through the distortion of the lens, I knew him instantly. Orson Vance. Years ago, I had chased his name through classified files. A ghost tied to shell corporations, corrupt defense contractors, and the kind of organized network that never leaves fingerprints. He had disappeared in 2015, and now here he was, shaking hands with Claire's mentor like it was the most natural thing in the world. I watched as Rhodes leaned in close to speak, his expression sharp, nothing casual about the meeting. Papers changed hands. A drive slipped into his pocket. No one else was there to witness it, just the security camera mounted high on the wall. When the clip ended, the image froze on their handshake. I stared at it for a long time, not because I was surprised, but because I knew what it meant. Claire wasn't just standing next to danger. She had been dragged into the center of it, whether she realized it or not. Whatever breach Cole had traced, whatever lines had been crossed, Rhodes was using her credentials like a shield, and Vance was pulling the strings. And now, whether I wanted it or not, I was standing between her and a disaster that could bury us both. I asked Claire to meet me somewhere no one else would think to look, a place we both knew from stories, but she had never been to herself. 40 miles outside San Antonio, there's an abandoned FBI training facility, a cluster of low concrete buildings, sun-bleached and cracked, where weeds have grown tall through the asphalt and the wind whistles through broken windows. It used to be a proving ground for agents who were in too deep to be seen. Now it was a graveyard of secrets, which made it perfect. She pulled up in a rental car, hesitating before stepping out, her blazer buttoned tight like that fabric could hold her together. I didn't wait for pleasantries. I handed her a thick envelope, paper worn soft from being opened and closed 100 times. She slid the pages out, and the first photograph stopped her cold. Rhodes and Vance in that garage, a handshake framed by shadows. Beneath it were logs from WitnessNet, her name stamped across the breach. And then I took out the small recorder and hit play. His voice filled the empty air, low and deliberate. She's our most valuable pawn. Feed her just enough of the truth to keep her righteous. She's young, idealistic. The system will swallow her whole before she ever realizes who she's shielding. Claire's fingers tightened on the paper. For a moment, she didn't breathe. Her eyes were wide, glossy, but she didn't argue. I just wanted to do the right thing, she whispered, voice breaking. I thought I was helping. I shook my head. Helping without knowing who you're saving isn't justice. It's blindness. She looked at me then. I really looked. And for the first time since I'd come home, there was no anger in her eyes, only fear and the start of understanding. The house in the suburbs of Houston looked almost the same as it had when I was a kid. White siding, freshly painted, the smell of lemon polish hanging in the air like a memory that had been staged. We gathered around the dining table, a roast chicken in the center, scalloped potatoes and wine set out like it was any other family dinner. My father spoke about golf, my mother about church, while Claire barely touched her plate. I knew why they had asked me to come. There was a manila envelope waiting in the center of the table, placed there like bait, full of forged documents meant to prove I had been manipulating data to rebuild my name. They wanted a confrontation, something they could control, but before I could even open my mouth, the night cracked open. The front door slammed against the wall with a sound like thunder, and 3 men in black tactical gear stormed inside, their boots hammering against the floor. Masks covered their faces, rifles in their hands. One of them pointed straight at me. Her, he barked. She knows too much. Another gestured at Claire and my parents. The rest, no longer useful. The room erupted in chaos. My mother screamed. My father stood frozen with his hands half raised, and Claire's chair scraped back across the tile. I didn't run. Years of training taught me to move with the chaos, not against it. I fell backward off my chair, my hand sliding under my sleeve to press the sewn-in panic trigger hidden in my blazer cuff. It was a silent signal, one that Cole would recognize. In the seconds before they grabbed me, before the world went black, one thought cut clear through the panic. This was no family dinner. It had been a trap all along. By the time they dragged me across the floor, the silent signal had already been sent. A tiny pulse buried in the thread of my sleeve, but none of them noticed. They bound my wrists with duct tape, rough enough to scrape skin, and forced me and the rest of my family down into the basement. The narrow wooden stairs groaned with every step, and the air grew damp and stale the deeper we went. They tied us to a support post, my father first, then my mother, and finally Claire beside me, our backs pressed to the cold cement wall. The basement smelled of dust and gasoline, an ugly mix that made the whole room feel like a trap waiting to be sprung. In the corner, I saw black duffel bags, their contents obvious from the shapes inside: wires, charges, timing devices. This wasn't a scare tactic. It was an execution with a clock. I kept my breathing slow, steady, counting heartbeats, buying time. The men spoke in low voices, too low for my parents to hear, but I recognized the tone. Professionals who believed this was already over. One of them crouched close enough for me to see his eyes behind the mask. "Director Lane," he said, like the title was an insult. "You thought you could disappear. You thought you could bury what you know." I didn't answer. Not yet. My mother's sobs filled the silence. My father's jaw was set so tight it looked carved from stone, and Claire's hand strained against the ropes until her knuckles went white. I leaned just slightly against her shoulder, enough to let her know I was still thinking, still planning. Somewhere above us, out beyond the walls, I trusted Cole had seen the signal. Now all that was left was to survive, long enough for it to matter. Upstairs, in the dark streets outside the quiet neighborhood, Cole and his small strike team gathered in an unmarked van, listening to the faint signal coming from the beacon I had triggered. Blueprints of the house glowed on their tablets as they mapped every point of entry. Cole's voice was calm, controlled, but I knew that tone well enough to hear the urgency beneath it. Inside the basement, the men thought they had time. They were wrong. While they argued about how to stage the blast, I bent my wrists until the tape began to fray against the sharp edge of the floorboard behind me. Every movement was measured, every breath timed to the rhythm of their boots on the stairs above. When the tape snapped, I stayed still, waiting for them to turn away before I slid my hands free. I moved low and quiet toward the bags in the corner, my fingers already searching for the main charge. The wiring was precise, the layout unmistakable. 3 nodes in a V pattern, the mark of a network I had studied before. As I worked, one of them came down to check the timers, and I had to press myself into the shadows. When he turned his back, I cut the first wire, then the second, each move rehearsed in my mind 1,000 times. The last charge was harder. Crosswired to trigger early, but I managed it with seconds to spare. As I pulled the detonator loose, I saw a name etched on the inside panel of the control box, a signature from the one who had prepared it. Hale, Victor Hale, a senior figure in the bureau, someone I had once blocked from promotion. The betrayal clicked into place like a puzzle snapping shut. They had an inside man. And now I knew exactly who it was. The last wire snapped free just as heavy footsteps thundered down the basement stairs. I shoved the detonator into my pocket and turned toward Claire, cutting her bindings with a shard of metal I'd hidden in my sleeve. Her wrist came free just in time for us to duck behind the old furnace as the first masked man rounded the corner. He spotted the loose ropes and lunged, but Claire moved faster than I expected, grabbing the closest thing to a weapon, a broken chair leg, and swinging it with every ounce of strength she had. The impact knocked him off balance, giving me just enough of a window to slam into him, sending his rifle skidding across the floor. We fought in the narrow space, blows and elbows until he went down and stayed down. For a second, There was nothing but the sound of our breathing. Then the others came. They stormed in with weapons raised, shouting, and the room turned into a blur of motion. I grabbed the rifle from the floor and fired low, aiming for legs and knees to buy time rather than kill. Claire stayed at my back, throwing whatever she could get her hands on, refusing to let them pull her away again. And then, just as one of them swung his weapon up toward us, the house exploded with the sound of shattering glass and boots hitting the floor. Cole's team came in like a storm, precise and silent, flashlights cutting through the dark. Within seconds, the room was full of federal agents. Every one of our attackers pinned to the ground. Cole pulled me to my feet and scanned the basement with sharp eyes, making sure there were no more threats. For the first time that night, I let myself breathe. We were still standing, and we were not done. 10 days later, under the cold white lights of a congressional hearing room in Washington, I stood alone at a long table, a nameplate in front of me that read Harper Lane. Cameras lined the walls, and the room was full of people who had once written me off as a cautionary tale. This time, I wasn't hiding. I laid everything out with no hesitation. The breach in WitnessNet, the forged files, the infiltration that reached from Houston to the highest offices. I presented decrypted logs, video evidence of Samuel Rhodes with Orson Vance, and the proof that an insider had made it all possible. That insider had a name they all knew, Victor Hale. As the images played on the screens, the room fell silent, the weight of their own oversight pressing down on them. When the last file closed, I didn't ask for my old position back. I asked for change. I proposed a full restructuring of WitnessNet, an independent oversight board with no political influence, a system built on accountability instead of loyalty. Some of them resisted, of course, but they couldn't argue with what they had just seen. And while they debated, federal agents moved quietly through the side doors. Hale sat 3 rows behind me, still trying to hide behind his title, until the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. He didn't fight. He just looked at me with that empty kind of anger that comes when someone finally realizes they've lost. I met his eyes, calm, steady, and said nothing. Outside the building, the winter air hit sharp against my face as I walked down the steps. It wasn't victory I felt. It was something heavier, something quieter. The truth was finally out, but the work of repairing what had been broken had only just begun. The hallway outside the hearing room was lined with reporters and aides rushing past with folders and phones, but for a moment it felt like the world had gone quiet. I was halfway to the exit when I saw her, my mother, standing still against the far wall as if she had been waiting for me. There was no pride in her eyes, no polished words prepared the way she always had before. Just a kind of fragile hesitation I had never seen in her. For years, she had pretended not to see me, spoken about me like I was someone who had made herself forgettable. Now, when she finally stepped forward, there was no armor left. She looked smaller than I remembered, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. When she did, her voice wasn't sharp, wasn't rehearsed. It was low and almost uncertain. If what we saw in there is who you are, then maybe I've been wrong for a very long time, she said. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was more than I had ever expected. I searched her face for anger, for resentment, but there was only exhaustion and something that almost looked like regret. I nodded once, not trusting myself to say anything without breaking the fragile stillness that had settled between us. She didn't try to hug me, didn't ask for forgiveness. She just placed her hand on my arm for a brief second, then let go and turned back down the hall. It was a crack in the wall that had stood between us for so many years, small, imperfect, but a beginning all the same. And for the first time in a long while, I let myself believe that maybe she had finally started to see me. After the hearings ended and the headlines began to fade, I was offered everything people in this city spend their lives chasing. Reinstatement, new titles, the promise of a position that would put me back at the center of power. I said no to all of it. I packed what little I had kept from those years, left the city without ceremony, and drove west until the noise of Washington felt like another lifetime. I found a small desert town in Arizona, the kind of place with a single main street and a school that still uses a gym for everything from graduations to basketball games. The air there is dry, the horizon endless, and for the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling the weight of other people's expectations pressing against my chest. I began to teach, not in a classroom, but in a way that felt more real. I worked with teenagers who thought justice was a word they had only ever heard in movies. Kids who had no one to tell them that truth doesn't come easy. We talked about risk and consequence, about how to stand in the storm without becoming part of it, about how silence can be strength but also a trap. I never told them the full story of what I had done or what I had lost. They didn't need to know that. What they needed was someone who understood that every choice has a cost. Over time, they began to trust me, and I began to remember what it felt like to live a life that didn't revolve around secrets. It was quieter than the life I had left behind, smaller, but it was finally mine, built not on duty or fear, but on something that might one day grow into peace. One evening, as the sun began to sink behind the mountains and the sky turned that impossible shade of blue that only exists in the desert, I sat at the small wooden desk in my house, sorting through the few emails that still find their way to me. Among the usual noise, there was one message that stopped me cold. The subject line was only 4 words. I am not afraid. It was from Claire. I opened it slowly, my fingers still for a moment before I scrolled down. The body of the message was short, almost hesitant. She wrote about standing on a stage at a conference, speaking not as someone being used, but as someone building, someone asking hard questions. She said she had started to see the system for what it was and what it could be, and that for the first time in years she felt free. At the end, there were only 5 words that mattered. Thank you. I'm not afraid anymore. I sat back in my chair and let the words settle. Through the window, the mountains were painted gold by the last light of the day, and the air was still and silent. For years, I had thought victory meant clearing my name, forcing the world to see what they had refused to see. Now I realized that her choosing to stand on her own, was the only victory that mattered. I walked outside, the dry ground crunching under my boots, and leaned against the wooden fence at the edge of the property. The desert stretched out forever, the kind of wide open that feels like a promise. I let myself smile, not a triumphant smile, not even a proud one, but something quieter, a smile that came from finally knowing that we had both found a way to stand without fear.